Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Real Thomas Jefferson. We return today to our long dormant series, One Work, Five Questions, as we take a look at an 1816 letter of Jefferson that is teeming with political and philosophic content. I am your host, George Gorey, formerly a captain with the California Highway Patrol and currently a criminal investigator with the Alameda County District Attorney's Office in the San Francisco Bay Area. The aim of this show is to examine thoroughly one work of Thomas Jefferson through five questions. That work today is Thomas Jefferson's 1816 letter to Samuel Kercheval. Dr. Holichuk, soi-disant colonel, is a professor of philosophy and history who taught at institutions such as the University of Pittsburgh, University of Michigan, Rowan University, and Rutgers University, Camden. He is an author editor of over 70 books and nearly 400 published essays, formal and informal, on topics such as ethics, ancient philosophy, science, psychoanalysis, and critical thinking. His current research is on Thomas Jefferson. He is acknowledged by many scholars to be the world's foremost authority and has published over 300 essays, formal and informal, and has 30 books on Thomas Jefferson, and he also writes about the Ukraine. So before we get into it, we're going to talk about, I'll give you a little background here. Who was the person writing to Jefferson? Samuel Kercheval. Samuel Kercheval was a Virginia lawyer and author in Jefferson's time. On June 13, 1816, he wrote Jefferson a letter under the name Henry Tompkinson and enclosed a political pamphlet he had authored and had published advocating a constitutional convention and a revision and amendment of the Virginia state constitution. In this letter, he was asking for Thomas Jefferson's feedback and opinion on the merits and demerits of his work. And before we get started, this letter is very diverse and very long, and it covers really some broad, seemingly unrelated topics, but they are related, as you will see it come full circle, as Dr. Holichuk explains the letter. Good afternoon, Dr. Holichuk.
How you doing?
Colonel, I should say.
Colonel, yeah. Captain, how are you doing?
I'm doing well.
Is that demeaning if you're an inspector? Inspector is a much higher rank than captain, I assume, even though you're expected. But
no, it's actually it's actually a lower rank.
So all these old 1930s and 40s movies I'm watching with inspectors, so it's a lower rank. I'll have to keep that in mind. All right, let's get going here.
All right. Question number one. The letter from Thomas Jefferson to Samuel Kercheval appears to be a clear exposition of Jeffersonian republicanism taken to its fullest degree. Can you explain the difference between Jeffersonian republicanism as Jefferson describes it in this letter and classical republicanism, the classical republicanism of the ancients? Did Jefferson include parts of classical republicanism in his theory, or Republican government as laid out by Kercheval?
Yeah, I mean, this is a common question in some sense because some scholars are divided on this issue in terms of what Jefferson was, a lock-in liberal, liberal Adamist, or a classical republicanism, or republicanist of the sort of Cicero, Aristotle, Plato, something like that. So I'll talk about that in a bit. So you mentioned that this was a letter by Kercheval asking about constitutions. He sends Jefferson this pamphlet about constitutions, and he's got some thoughts, and he knows that Jefferson, he probably knows Jefferson crafted a constitution himself for Virginia that never went to the convention and so forth. So the whole idea of the whole concept of constitutionality, republicanism is what glues all these threads together here. So that you're right to say there's a diversity, a plurality of topics, but they're all sort of threaded together by Jefferson's notion of republicanism as it relates to crafting a constitution for Virginia or any worthwhile republic. So we're going to answer questions such as why should a constitution be revised and what should be in it? And we're going to see that there are certain universal things that apply to any constitution, namely regard for rights and things like that, regard for equality of all people, regard for people to determine their own course in life, their own path, what they consider to be happiness. And then there are, of course, particulars and so forth, that how I decide to, if I want to be a lawyer or a politician, I want to be a farmer, something. So lock-in, Jefferson seems to be very much in the camp of the Lockean liberals, of the Lockean atomists, liberal atomism. He says governments are Republican only in proportion as they embody the will of their people and they execute it. So the majority of the people run a government. That seems to be in the camp of what I will call Lockean liberalism or liberal atomism, the primacy. When I'm looking philosophically at this issue, I'm building on the primacy of the individual. And Jefferson says 1,000 times governments are for the sake of the individuals in them. Now, the classical republicanism advocated by G.A. Pocock, Lance Banning, Gary Will, so forth, is a challenge to the view and says that what really is foundational for Jefferson is the primacy of the state. Now, my view has always been that this is a false dichotomy, meaning that it's neither primacy of the individual or primacy of state, but both, because Jefferson's moral sense theory, I mean, you're going to read Jefferson, you're going to think he's a liberal atomist, but I think once you factor in his moral sense and what he says about each of us being born with a sense of right and wrong, with duties to other human beings, right, we are bound to be social creatures by our nature. So we want certain liberties, but we want liberties within the framework of a social setting, which is going to, mandate that rights be maintained and so forth. So I think he's not only drawing from both, I think he's both a liberal and a Republican at the same time in the Ciceronian sense. I'll read you one quote from the letter. He says, if experience be called for, appeal to that of our 15 or 20 governments for 40 years and show me where the people have done half the mischief in those 40 years that a single despot would have done in a single year, so forth. So he's appealing to, yes, the people can riot and rebel and overthrow a government and all that, but this is nothing compared to what he says, what a tyrant does in one particular year. Someone who doesn't obey the Constitution. And that captures Jefferson. It's just the government always has to be government vox, V-O-X, populi, P-O-P-U-L-I, Latin, voice of the people, vox populi. But it's the people embodied in a social setting with regard for all other people and committed to fullest political participation within a governmental setting. Governments can't work unless all people. This is a Ciceronian element. All people need to give. And notice how much of his life he's given, 40-something years, and on retirement, he starts the University of Virginia, which is political participation. So all of his life he's given. And this will also explain why he prefers, when he's talking about judicial matters, he always said, I prefer a jury to an individual judge. The judges can be corrupt. It's hard to find 12 corrupt people in a jury. Again, that's the voice of the people. So I think Jefferson is both a classical Lockean atomist or a liberal, as well as a Ciceronian Republican. He's both.
Okay. And that kind of dovetails into our second question, which in the second question that I have for you, in the letter, Jefferson refers to republicanism, and this is a quote, republicanism is in the spirit of the people, and quote, not in the Constitution, certainly. What does he mean by this?
A really good question. I like that. And this gets at the gist of Jefferson. And if you want to understand Jefferson's political philosophy, this question nails it. He says, I'll read from the book, his letter. He says, where then is our republicanism to be found? Not in our Constitution, certainly, but in the spirit of our people, as you said. That would oblige even a despot to govern us republicanly. Owing to this spirit and nothing in the form of our Constitution, all things have gone well. Now, what does he mean? That we should disregard the Constitution is just a papery thing that carries no weight and should be disregarded? No. It must be obeyed, but constitutions change. Each generation, roughly speaking, as people change. I have said before, and I think this is correct, the second a constitution is ratified, it becomes in some sense obsolete because the population changes in some sense. But Jefferson thinks, okay, you can't just constantly change, be in the process of changing the Constitution each day. Let's wait a generation. generation uses Buffon's mortuary tables to be about 19 years for a generation. Roughly every 19 years, let's sit down, have some delegates talk about changes to the Constitution that reflect the vox populi. And I'm going to quote from this letter. It's a very, very beautiful quote. Some men look at constitutions with sanctimonious reverence and deem them like the Ark of the Covenant, too sacred to be touched. Notice how he doesn't capitalize Ark of the Covenant. They ascribe to the men of the preceding age of wisdom more than human and suppose what they did is beyond amendment. I knew that age well. I'm not going to read the rest of the quote. It's a very interesting quote. And that's what a lot of people do today. We've always done it. So our founding father said this. Thomas Jefferson said that. You know, and Thomas Jefferson say, "Why are you quoting me all the time? I'm dead. I've been dead for close to 300 years, or not quite 200 something years. So why are you quoting me? Not quite 200 years, right? This is going to be 200 years next year, 26. Yeah, 1826 he died. So his words carry some weight insofar, carry a lot of weight insofar he uttered certain timeless truths in his declaration: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, rights for all people. Those things will never go away. And I think that's why I wrote my book on the disease of liberty, because there's something, and I'm working on a book on the Constitution, on Declaration of Independence. There are things uttered in there. That word liberty and the word equality there are two words that resonate with people and will always resonate with people. That's why the Declaration will never die. That's why Jefferson will never die, in spite of these assholes we have today that are trying to bury him and make him look the fool. He articulated those words quite beautifully. And I think, in spite of what people say, well, you own slaves and stuff, right? We'll talk about that's a separate issue. We've talked about that. What are you going to do to free yourself from the slaves? It's not as simple as you think. But constitutions are not documents that should be looked upon with reverence. They should be obeyed once they're made, right? They need to be obeyed. We have a current administration today with Donald Trump who just violates the Constitution a good 5 or 10 times every day. I don't think he even knows it. If he can read, if he's read it, he has no regard for it. And then our senators and representatives really don't hold him to task for not obeying the Constitution, not obeying the judgments of the judiciary as they relate to his interests. But the Constitution is law of the land at the time, but it'll change, and it changes in a progressive manner. So it's important that we obey the Constitution. It's a wonderful document, but we can't think that the words of the Constitution written by the founding fathers and so forth in that generation will last for all time and will fit us like hand in glove. These things need to be amended as we change.
Well, and it kind of gets to the third question, is when Jefferson talks about, what is his purpose? In this letter, he refers to his ward republics in a graduated state from the federal government all down to the state, county, and ward level. What is his thought process, and what does he mean by that? The purpose of that?
You flatter me. I think you know the answer. It's just in his second inaugural address, he addresses that. He says, how are you going to have a large nation state like the United States, which for all intents and purposes becomes a fairly large nation as it's a confederation of 13 states? How are you going to have a sort of functional sense of unity for something so big? You have to, the Confederation it's composed of 13 states. Those states each have counties, and in each county you have wards, right? So he always says, divide and divide again, and this again is the Lockean element of his thinking. How are the people going to be heard? Well, they're going to be representatives that speak on behalf of them. Very interestingly, how did the revolutionists, the colonial revolutionists, know that they were acting on behalf of the people? Well, they tried to feel the pulse of the people by doing things, by having a day of prayer and fasting in Virginia. Jefferson pushed that through the House of Delegates and so forth. Very important that if they saw that when they passed legislation to have a day of fasting and prayer, if no one was doing that, then there would be some evidence that the people aren't behind their sort of revolutionary activities. But by breaking things down to the ward level, when every county there would be something, he called them hundreds at times. Imagine a ward being a square piece of land where every square mile you have every 10 miles, you have 10 by 10 squares of a ward. He calls them 6 by 6 one time. He says 10 by 10. Of course, for states, the way they're parceled off, you can't do it neatly. But imagine just parceling off the land within a particular state in such a way that you have a small government, you have a school, a ward school to teach people reading, writing, and so forth. You have a sheriff and so forth, a prison. You have everything that makes that unit, that own political parcel of land, functional and unique and alive. And then so in some sense, Jefferson thinks that, he says the organization of our county administration may be thought more difficult, but follow principle and the knot unties itself and divide the counties into wards of such size that every citizen can attend when called on. So it's important. Participation in a Jeffersonian republic is critical. Again, here's the Ciceronian element, Ciceronian republicanism. It's not a matter of just giving people rights and allowing them to do whatever they want. That is a given. But you can't just go ahead and do whatever you want. You have to give back. It's a functional, the government is sort of a living, breathing thing in a manner of speaking. If all people aren't participating to their fullest extent, to some extent, government's just not going to work. We're going to give you liberties, but you have to give something back. Remember John F. Kennedy's fine saying, right? You probably know better than I do. Don't ask what.
Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country.
Yeah, it's a beautiful sentiment. It's just very Jeffersonian. Jefferson would probably say, yeah, ask about what your country can do for you, but also give to the country itself, because it's a reciprocal relationship, right? He says each one has a constable, a military company, a patrol, a school, provisions for the poor, their own portion of the public roads, churches, and so forth. It's self-sufficient. So you break them down in the wards, and people who are farmers, say, can at least participate in ward government to some extent, while they're farmers, right? Because farming is going to take all of their time. So it's important. You're breaking it down, but you're also demanding, in a manner of speaking, inviting, in a sense of not inviting, strongly inviting people to participate for the good of the whole. Otherwise, everything breaks down.
And I take it he means by that participation, they are furthering the cause of Republican government and their own liberty and freedom by their participation. Seems like to me that's his intent.
Yeah,
with these words.
That there's this reciprocity between receiving, because the government's going to give you liberties and allow you to live as you want, but you have to give back, right? Because it protects you. It conducts foreign affairs, and it protects your liberties. It allows you to protest and do all the things. It allows you to overthrow the government in some sense if it doesn't serve your interests and so forth. At least that's Jefferson thought. So there's this reciprocity.
Well, as we go on to the next question, you can start to see, I think, where this comes full circle, and you'll obviously explain this really well. In this letter, Thomas Jefferson refers back to his concept of government by the quote-unquote living, and he first articulated that in a letter to James Madison on September 6, 1789, that one generation cannot bind the future, and that every 19 or 20 years, a revision of the laws of the Republic, so to speak, should happen. Why does Jefferson see such revision as necessary for Republican government?
Well, I went some ways to answering this before, because he saw society moving in a particular direction, progressing. People are becoming more and more moral. At least we're adhering more and more, listening more and more to the moral sense, to our feelings of what are right and wrong. We don't treat prisoners of war as badly as they used to be treated. We don't slaughter prisoners of war. We treat them rather humanely, and all sorts of things. In political governments, look, he even said, why Aristotle and Plato and political philosophers of that ilk in many, many centuries ago, millennia ago, are irrelevant, because they never came up with the concept of representative government. Aristotle clearly talks about three forms of government: government by a king, government by an aristocracy, by a few, and then government of the many. And Aristotle says, well, the best form of government when it's good is the king, because he can do a lot of good. When it's the worst form of government is a king who becomes a despot, only thinks about himself because he can do a lot of bad. The least effective government is what we call democracy today. He calls a polity. Government of the many, when it's good, it doesn't do too much good, because most people getting together can't agree on too much and do so much good. But when it's bad, it doesn't really harm a lot, because, again, you have government by the people, and there's all this collision of ideas. So this is what he called the demokratia in Greek. Demokratia, and that's the bad form of government of the many, and it really is not the terribly bad government, because you put political responsibility in the hands of the people, it doesn't work. No. All this was relevant, and then you had the aristocracy or oligarchy. Oligarchy doesn't mean what we think it means today. It means government of the few. Now, all this sounds really, kind of interesting and theoretical, and Aristotle didn't think that just these three all over the place. He thought political polities were blends of different sorts of elements. So there were blends and stuff. But he also thought you can only have governments can only be as large, say 200,000 people or something like that, no more. And Jefferson is envisaging something much larger, right? And so you have the divide and divide again. And so how does it work? It works because if I'm a farmer, I can't oversee political affairs at the federal level, even the state level, but I can have representatives do that for me. So that's this whole notion. So go back to James Madison, this whole notion of what's called generational sovereignty. One generation can't bind another. Jefferson is talking of different ways of binding. One is financially, fiscally. Jefferson, when he married his wife, inherited his father-in-law, John Wales, huge debt. And it took him many, many, many years to get out of that debt, to build, And so in some sense, inheriting that debt tied his hands. Now imagine, let's talk about going to war. We decide to go to war. Country A goes to war against country B. And then we're continuing this war. Look at the warring that happened between England and France over the centuries, always at war. If I'm constantly at war, I'm building up a great financial debt. So my generation who starts the war, I leave off as the King of England or the Prime Minister or something like that. And the next generation has this enormous debt. So, matter of speaking, you're inheriting, the next generation inheriting the debt of my deeds. So my hands are tied. I can't do and live as I want to live. I've got to deal with this war debt, continue a war, or come up some way of being fiscally responsible. And that's not being free. Jefferson was paranoid about balancing the budget. He did a damn good job in his administration, even though he bought land, right, and doubled the size of the country.
Quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's extraordinary what he did in 1803. But the whole notion is just this whole notion of not burdening another generation with your ideology, with your finances, with your debt and things like that. He says, I'm not among those who fear the people. They and not the rich are our dependents. For continued freedom and to preserve their independence, we must not let our rulers load us with perpetual debts. Thinking fiscally here. We must make our election between economy and liberty, or profusion and servitude, right? Liberty presupposes freedom to act And again, if I'm at war with another country and we have a tremendous debt that goes on to the next generation, a political debt, the next generation is not free to behave politically as it wishes to behave. And I think this is something Jefferson really saw that ought to be applied at every level of political economy, right? Parents and children, and things like that. Even within the family, there needs to be sort of fiscal responsibility. Um, I mean, does that make sense? I don't know if I'm clear enough here.
Absolutely, yeah. And you look at it today, and I know that obviously we live in a different time, but there are some time-honored principles like he's bringing up about burdening other people with debt. The federal government today is in debt to the tune of what, $33 trillion,
Really? Yeah.
astronomical sum, which, I think there's many people who believe it could never be paid off. I mean, and it continues borrowing. And you look at the mentality that Jefferson had and looking forward to the future, not wanting to burden his grandchildren and their grandchildren and generations to come. And today, whether they're on the right or the left, the parties and the politicians in power really have no problem, it seems like, running the nation into the ground. I mean, because now we have such a massive debt, I think it would be unfathomable to someone like him.
Yeah, if he were to come back today, I think he would throw up. Just as you said, 33 trillion, which is how do you pay that back? The reason why, how do we get away with it? Well, what if China
Right.
asks for money? Well, China's not going to do that because, they trade with us quite a bit, and we buy a lot of Chinese goods in spite of the tariffs or whatever. We buy a lot of Chinese goods, and so they're perfectly happy to not ask us to pay that off, at least at this point in time, because they still do pretty well commercially in our exchange of goods with them. Like it or not, we love Chinese goods. That's why there's an trade imbalance there. We buy them. If you buy AliExpress or Temu or things like that, you're getting cheap Chinese goods that are pretty good. And I purchased these in the past myself, and the quality's there for certain items and so forth. You can't complain. If you want to get trade equality, you stop buying Chinese goods. That's all. That's one thing. I mean, it's all of us are responsible for that. But anyways, here's another quote you'll like. He said, I talk about how people paint him. Dumas Malone painted him a political relativist, and I think that's wrong. Adrian Koch, same thing. In that, we're free to pursue our own course of happiness. He thinks that different people are going to do a multiplicity of different things. And I don't think that's right. Like the ancient Stoics and Aristotle and Plato and the virtuous thinker, there's a right way to live and a wrong way to live. We need to be virtue abiding, not vice abiding. So, he says, I know that the laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. As that becomes more developed, more enlightened, new discoveries are made, new truths disclosed, and manners and opinions change with the change of circumstances. Institutions must advance also and keep pace with the times. We might as well require a man to still wear the coat that fitted him when a boy, as civilized society to remain ever under the regiment of their barbarous ancestors. Go back to the founding fathers and the Constitution. Well, the Constitution hasn't changed. Notice he's not talking about any sort of random change, progressive change. We're learning more about how the world works. We've got Kepler's laws of planetary motion, Newton's laws, Galileo law of falling bodies, distance is proportion to the time squared, and so forth. We're learning more about how the world works. We're becoming more moral, Jefferson thinks. He's a product of the Enlightenment. So the constitutions must change to accommodate these advances, not just accommodate changes, advanced changes. So this is very beautiful articulation of the sentiment that we are progressive individuals in that letter. I like that quote. So many quote-worthy passages here, right?
Absolutely. And his last one, I think you already answered this, but I still think it's a good question. Question number 5 is, as Thomas Jefferson, he ends his response to Kercheval, he spells out the advantage of the ward division, and you touched on that earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And but maybe you could reiterate, because we're coming full circle, like I said at the beginning, Why does he feel the breakdown all the way down to the ward, and then even the family is essential to preserve Republican government? What about that is that preservation?
Well, he's dealing with the problem of the vox populi, VOXPOPULI, the voice of the people, vox populi. How is the voice of the people going to be heard in a large government? You break things down to the ward system, and then people can participate at the ward levels, let their ward representatives know how they think about particular issues. The people at the ward level can communicate to the politicians at the next level, and that level to at the county level, and the people at the county level can communicate to representatives at the state level, and the state level to the federal level. And there's a channel of communication. It's indirect, of course, right? But in many respects, it works, Jefferson thinks. And he goes out and says in his second inaugural address, he says the larger, when you have this breakdown system of break down the system all the way towards, he says the larger the nation, the more efficient it becomes. Right? Sounds strange. It becomes efficient because these local disturbances, like you might have at the Boston Tea Party or something, very much is a challenge for Massachusetts, right? But it's not so much a challenge at the federal level once the nation forms. Once the nation forms, you had something like that, because it's a local disturbance, and local disturbances create problems locally, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not an enormous disturbance at the federal level, he thinks. So the question becomes, how do you collect the voice? He says this, but how collect their voice, the voice of the people? This is the real difficulty. If you're invited by private authority to county or district meetings, these divisions are so large that few will attend, and their voice will be imperfectly or falsely pronounced. Here then would be one of the advantages of ward divisions I propose. The mayor of every ward, on a question like the present, would call his ward together, take the simple yea or nay of its members, conveys these to the county court, right, and so forth, and people at the county court, if need, can convey that to the state level, and so on. Everything works from the bottom. It's bottom-up government. But morally speaking, there's reciprocity. So in a sense, this is where we go full circle. He's talking about constitutions, and he gets to the wards because we solve the problem of how government, representative government works. It works by going all the way down to wards where people can participate in ward activities, and then representatives there can go out to the county level, and they can go out to the state level, and there's a transmission of how the people think all the way down. Like you said, we do come full circle. And then he also says, again, I'll read another quote quickly. Each generation is as independent of the one preceding as that was of all which had gone before it. It has then, like them, a right to choose for itself the form of government it believes promotive of its happiness. Consequently, to accommodate to the circumstances which it finds itself that received from its predecessors, right? So we need constitutional renewal to ensure this. Put all this together. Again, it sounds like political relativism. You can choose any form of government you want. But people are progressive people. They're progressing morally, so they're not going to choose anything. They're going to choose government that lines itself up with science. This is the partnership, the hand going into the glove. Education and government. So science and government work hand in glove, right? And we're going to be talking about a little bit about how that works next week. I mean, do you have any comments? We still have 5 minutes or so. I mean,
Yeah,
you asked some really good questions.
Well, thank you. And I really like this letter, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk about it, because I'd read it several times before. And it does tie back to his Earth Belongs to the Living letter back in September of 1789 to Madison. But it all presupposes, one of the things I liked about it, is an educated citizenry. The reason that these things are all accomplishable, right, in his thought, it appears to me, correct me if I'm wrong, is that he's talking about an educated citizenry, one that like in his earlier plan for education, the elementary schools, the system, to have an educated citizenry, you can fulfill a ward republic system, and you can bring government down to the very bottom level of folks to have them participate because they're well educated and they're well informed in their society, which binds them together. That's how I always read it, and so that was one of the reasons I picked it.
Well,
Do you believe that
yeah, I mean, they're educated, at least at the lower levels, they're educated in ward schools, right? The primary schools, insofar as they get reading, writing, and arithmetic so they can conduct their own affairs. If I don't know how to read and write, like our current president, well, he can write, can't read, science. If I don't know how to do that, I can get cheated when I'm behaving commercially with other people. I'm not going to know how to participate politically, how to vote, how to interact with my representatives, and so forth. You get that primary education that all people need for any government to work, right? And then at the grammar schools, we'll talk about this next week, we get people that are getting an education, intermediate education before you go on to the university. A university like William and Mary or University of Virginia, where you can get training to be someone who studies law, someone who's a politician, or so forth, whatever. But without education, the thing doesn't work. And education and the whole thing is set up to encourage participation. But I think he just thinks, and he presumably is naive here, he thinks people are going to want to participate because of their moral sense. We just will. We're not even going to think about it. We maybe need a kick in the ass to do it, but we're going to do it because we care about each other. So if his moral sense theory doesn't work, if it's flawed, right, the whole thing in some sense may tumble.
Right. And like you said, it presupposes a moral and educated people that are looking for progress. And, people debate, obviously John Adams wouldn't have had that view whatsoever to that degree.
There's a wonderful quote by James Harrington Oceana. It's just government is very simple. It's like imagine two people fighting over dividing a cake. He says the answer is very simple. Let the people agree to have one person cut it and the other person choose. Once you do that, if you can by analogy, set up a sort of government that is like that. In other words, they're both participating. The person chooses, but the other person cuts. Well, you can be very careful about how you cut it if you know you might get the small end. Anyways.
Very true.
We're ready for next week, right?
Yes. Next week, we have it written down right here. And we are going to be talking about Jefferson's proposed curriculum for the University of Virginia. And the question is, was that curriculum biased to the disadvantage of the Federalists or Toryism?
Yeah, we'll talk about that. And I think what we can do with that question is talk about, the scheme for a system of education. Well, this will be following up on what we did today, how education is so important to have a vibrant Jeffersonian republic. And we'll talk about the three different levels with a focus on the curriculum at University of Virginia and if there were any biases in there and just what sort of education he thought that the new Republican leaders of Virginia should have. Well, anyways, you're wearing your police threads here, or no? I move back a little bit or stand up. Let's see what you got on. I thought you had something on. There we go. I just have sunflower. You're looking good. We'll see you again. And
all right. Thank you, Doctor, and thank you everybody for viewing today.
Take care. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.